I'm so honored to be here to welcome you to tonight's celebration for Elizabeth Leake's Fuori dal coro, Cultura femminile e mutamento sociale nell'Italia del dopoguerra. Elizabeth Leake is professor and chair of Columbia University's Italian department. Her areas of research include 20th century Italian narrative and theater, the cultural history of fascism and of the Republic, and the history and criticism of Italian cinema. Professor Leake's 2003 book, The Reinvention of Ignazio Silone, is the recipient of the Modern Language Association's Aldo and Jean Scaglione Publication Award for a manuscript in Italian literary studies. In 2011, she published Afterwards, Suicide and Authorship in 20th Century Italy, followed by Tex Willer, Un Cowboy nell'Italia del Dopoguerra in 2018, and a co-authored book on the history, literature, and cinema of eternal exile during fascism in 2019. Fuori dal coro, which we gather to celebrate, offers a profound meditation on the role of women in Italian pop culture from the post-war period to 1980, reflecting on their unique ability to serve as both mirror and agent of social transformation. Our panelists tonight are Rebecca Bauman, Associate Professor of Italian at Fashion Institute of Technology, State University of New York, teaching within the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures and serving as affiliated faculty in the Department of Film, Media, and the Performing Arts. Her research spans areas including youth culture, and fashion, culture, and theory, and Italian American studies. Nadia Binati is Kyriakos Tsakopoulos. Sorry, I was going to professor of University, a political theorist who specializes in modern and contemporary political thought and democratic and anti-democratic traditions. Professor Binati co-chaired the Columbia University Faculty Seminar on Political and Social Thought and was a co-editor with Andrew Urlatori of the academic journal Constellations, an international journal of critical and democratic theory. Giancarlo Lombardi is professor of comparative literature in French, film, and media cultures at the City University of New York's Graduate Center and executive officer of the PhD and MA program in comparative literature. Professor Lombardi's area of research include Italian and French film, feminist and gender studies, Italian cultural studies, and modern and contemporary Italian, French, and English literature. And if I might just give a personal note, in late 2017, just after completing my dissertation with Elizabeth as my advisor, I received word that I would be appearing on the quiz show Jeopardy! I shared the news, and Elizabeth responded with glee, "Just come and see me and prepare for pop culture." And now the world can benefit from her treasure trove of insight. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That's fantastic. And thank you to all the panelists for being here. I'm really grateful to see you and to have to hear your thoughts. Also, thanks to the Heyman Center or Heyman Center, depending on when and where you encountered it for the first time, because it's wonderful to be back after having been here as a fellow, which gave me time to do the research on this book. So it's really a lovely kind of closing of the circle. So my job is just to tell you, I think, what this book is about. What do I do? What does it do? This is a book that studies the politicization of Italian women from 1945 to 1980 through pop cultural production. So I analyze various phenomena of pop culture as capable of registering processes of cultural transformation and influencing the social and political dynamics of the country. Jenny put it perfectly, mirror and agent. So it's a kind of interpretive history of social transformation in post-war Italy through the representation of women in and the cultural production by women of pop music, of books, of fashion, film, and of course, real life people as well. And what emerges from my examination is the clear sense that without having been planned or programmed or prepared, that women's popular culture is and was an enormously important vehicle, a spontaneous vehicle for major social messages. Some of these are positive, You know, if you think about women's emancipation and the songs of Caterina Caselli or Patti Bravo, right? Just to name two. Others are maybe somewhat more negative. Consider, for example, the ways Italy's refusal to deal seriously with the fascist past immediately after the war was mediated by the superficial reconciliations and sublimated nostalgia performed by women at the Sanremo Music Festival in the early 1950s. So my argument isn't that these are all feminist messages, that these are feminist vehicles. They're not necessarily by any stretch. The other thing the book does is it takes seriously the role of pop culture as I said, as a vehicle for or as a phenomenon capable of recording processes of cultural transformation and influencing national, social, and political dynamics. So I think about how what was born as pop culture sometimes transforms into high culture and then into political culture and vice versa, right? It's a multi-directional phenomenon. And in order to do that, I mean, I had to come to terms with the assumptions that pop culture, that mass culture is crass, vulgar, junk, superficial, escapist. I'm not saying it's not okay to think that. I mean, the discussions at home about the value of certain pop songs, for example, were pretty vehement. I'm not saying everything Gigliola Cinquetti produced was a masterpiece, right? It's okay to think that some of this is not very interesting, right? It's perfectly legitimate to think that about some of these products, but that's only half the argument, right? Even when I think, golly, this is kind of a silly song, the point is that important things happen in these songs, around these songs. These are highly politicized spaces, right? Especially for women. I'll give you an example. I gave a series of book presentations this summer in Italy. And so, you know, these are book presentations at bookstores suggesting that the audience has a certain kind of cultural investment in literature, in publications, people with a certain degree of intellectual interest. And there were two things that strike me. First was that the publics were overwhelmingly female, like 90% every single time. And the recurrent phrase I heard from them was, this is a book that struck a chord, right? This was something, there's something personal about this book. And that men and women alike felt that I had constructed episodes that don't normally meet the kind of Manichaean description of low versus high culture, bad versus good culture, inauthentic consumerist versus authentic. Yeah. With low as this kind of mono-dimensional culture. Instead, both the men and the women in the audience said, you know, actually, what you're describing was the way we really lived. We had intellectual pretensions. We were politicized, but we also went dancing. We also went to the disco, right? So these are worlds that communicated with one another. We thought politically and we loved Donna Summer. Yeah. What's more, not only does cultural analysis often present pop culture as this kind of caricature, as a joke, pop is always, almost always in any case, declined in the feminine. So when you consider histories of Italian, La Canzone Italiana, for example, pop music in Italy, we start with Modugno, then there's Tenco, and then there's De Andre, no? And in the last chapter, the last 25 pages of 280 are the women, right? Crammed in. These are half histories. And in fact, when I first proposed this book to an Italian publisher, he gave me a long list of people whom I did not mention, skipping entirely the argument about politicized spaces, right? He wanted a compendium of female singers. And so he failed the book on the basis of the fact that I didn't have enough about, you know, Mina or whatever. So these are half histories. As a historian and as a critic, the question is, where are the women in every chapter of the history, right, of La Canzone Italiana or of Italian film or whatever it is? At the level of use, these artifacts have been really highly valued but the level of historiography, they've been completely disregarded. So the book is an attempt to write that other half of the history. In making the argument, I know that I run counter to the thinking that mass culture can't perform social critique because it's complicit in a hegemonic, in the maintenance of the hegemonic system devoted to its own survival. My position is that dominant culture is never monolithic, and the world is complex, and change occurs at places both lofty and humble. A history of the Alps isn't just about elite climbers. It's also about the families picnicking at the base of the mountains. And so a cultural history has to recognize the myriad pathways to social change, not simply the high culture ones. And at the same time, during these years, both mainstream political culture and counterculture in Italy were deeply masculinist. And it's within this complex system that the work of women's resistance takes place. Thank you.
Boy, I'm going to do my best to go quickly. See, this is being operated for me. Thank you. I couldn't help but use images. I'll just grab this one. I just want to thank everyone at the Heyman Center for organizing this, and my co-panelists, and especially Elizabeth Leake for writing this book, and for giving us all of this wonderful meat to discuss this evening. And it's also just a joy to be back at Columbia with so many familiar faces, and especially because Elizabeth was something of a mentor for me here during my days a while back. Elizabeth Leake begins her book with what I think is a particularly apt image of how consumption and popular culture and female subjectivity merged in post-war Italy, and this is the Vespa. She observes how this now iconic symbol of Italian design had a particular significance for women. It was easy to operate, and because it could be ridden while wearing a skirt or a dress, the Vespa was a means for women to achieve a kind of mobility previous generations had not enjoyed. For me, the idea of the Vespa as meant for social change calls to mind a particular scene in Lina Vertman's 1972 film, The Seduction of Mimi, a work, a work that captures many of the kind of socio-political transformations in Italy in the second half of the 20th century. In the film, the character of Mimi is a disaffected Sicilian laborer fleeing southern Italy to find work in the industrial north. There he finds sexual, social, and economic freedoms, but he is disconcerted when he receives a letter from his wife, Rosalia, who is in Sicily and who, from his perspective, is part of a traditional past that he would prefer to forget. In Rosalia's letter, she describes aspects of the newfound independence she has gained in her husband's absence. Like Mimi, she has become a factory worker, albeit in an industrial laundry service where she assures her husband she is employed amongst, quote, all female staff, so put your mind at rest, unquote. In addition to joining the workforce, Rosalia has taken up smoking and has started to wear makeup. But her signature achievement is that she has learned to drive a scooter. She is careful to point out that she has taken, quote, all moral and physical precautions, unquote, seen by her fastening her skirt between her legs and riding the scooter decorated with images of the Madonna and other holy relics that will presumably ensure the protection of her virtue. This scene effectively illustrates how women were physical participants in the relentless progress of modernization and mass consumption that had penetrated even the most conservative outposts of Italy's borders. The Vespa is just one vehicle for the social changes that Leake observes in her work. Through her readings of various media, she amply demonstrates the ways that popular culture placed women at the forefront, not just as consumers, but as agents of cultural discourse. I was intrigued by many of the examples she provides from film, literature, and even comic books, some of which were familiar to me, but some of which were new and provided many Google rabbit holes to explore. So impressed upon me how much fun this book must have been to research, even while it addresses very serious issues about how society privileges the visibility of women while still holding the power to legislate every aspect of women's lives. Perhaps the most prominent aspect of this work for me was the presence of pop singers, the so-called Urlatori in particular, who were featured on Italian TV variety shows and whose voices became the soundtrack for Italy's economic boom. Leake reveals how the performances of these singers, both in terms of music and text, were perhaps the most potent means for expressing shifts in attitudes towards women's autonomy in Italy. Most importantly for a fashion scholar like myself, she mentions how their image and clothing in particular helped communicate these shifts. I would like to give a brief example of how Italian pop stars utilized fashion to demonstrate changing ideologies relating to women's status. One case is that of the most famous of the Urlatori, Mina, whose fashion, is this working? Okay, well, yes, thank you. I don't know what's happening there. Maybe it's the Zoom. Whose role as a fashion icon has been noted by scholars, but whose sartorial image takes on particular relevance in the light of Leake's book. We can see how the progression of styles of Mina's dress mirrors many of the phases that Leake describes. If we can go to the next slide. There is the gambling look of the late 1950s and early 1960s, which features playful colors, expressive layering, and patterns that are reminiscent of children's wear, speaking to how pop music was a realm of play for female singers who still occupied a liminal space between adolescence and womanhood. Mina's image continued to transform as her on-screen and musical persona became more mature. Rather than becoming matronly, however, she becomes more experimental, as seen here in the next slide, in costume designers Piero Garibaldi's creation for a now famous pasta advertising campaign, demonstrating pop culture's merging of forms of expression and commercial context. As Mina aged, next slide, her styles became even more futuristic. And next one again, at times adopting masculine tailoring and glam rock aesthetics, as seen here in her makeup and in the next slide, that in many ways exaggerates but rejects traditional female beauty standards. It is this kind of analysis that Leake's book proposes, urging us to look more closely at the forms of embodiment and self-representation women in popular culture expressed throughout this period. To return to the Vespa scene from The Seduction of Mimi, we can see how that sequence and Leake's book articulate the paradoxes of female emancipation in Italy that began in the post-war period. In the film, Rosalia's qualifiers as to how she must carefully navigate the new norms for female visibility in the public sphere demonstrate the many ways that advances for women were piecemeal, limited, and at times rescinded. Even legislative hallmarks that emerged from that period, such as the Family Rights Act, the referendum on divorce, the legalization of abortion, did not spell wholesale liberation for Italian women, despite their prominence in pop cultural products of the time. Those inconsistencies resonate today, at a time when Italy has its first female prime minister, yet is subject to massive political and legislative efforts to preserve the traditional patriarchal family at a cost to women's rights. And if I may close with a provocation, it is to dwell further on the relevance of this book in the context of contemporary pop culture, not just in Italy, but in the United States as well. So we can go to the next slide. I leave with an image of a recent album cover that exemplifies the conundrum presented in this book. That is the celebration of women's agency in popular culture and the persistence of the misogyny and abjection to which she is subject. Thank you.
I also thank you all for inviting me and I'm not a popular culture historian, so I am a political theorist and I do my job. Now, but I'm Italian, so this book for me is like my diary, because I recognize myself piece by piece, beginning at the end in the 70s particularly, when I was young, adolescent, and I started listening both the American songs and the British songs, comparing them with the Italian one, and I rejected the Italian one radically, that I thought to be very boring and unexpressive. And if you see if you give a look at the list of the songs and the movies are much better production than the songs, I would say, and they represent the best of popular culture. Anyway, so I like to start with a citation, and from there to say something about women and politics. So Elizabeth writes at page 46. I try to translate in my own way. Unlike other countries in Europe, Italy was not able to preserve after World War II the achievements achieved by the women during the war. This is very interesting. So they were much more emancipated just between the 45 and 46 than after. That is, when they were making and fighting for the resistance for democracy, than after. This is interesting because it is as if this book shows us that there was a kind of detour, and they had to do the game of emancipation, but not through politics, but through popular culture. So popular culture is a way for them to achieve that kind of emancipation, moral, cultural, ethical emancipation, that it was so, at the beginning, important and vivid, and that disappeared. So I found it extremely interesting to combine these with the history of politics or political acquisition of democracy in World War II Italy. Now, this also book interesting because it was published in a year that is very important for the history of my country, which is 1945, 2025. In 1945, women achieved the right to vote. This was an important event. They achieved it in 2 years, in 2 moments. 45 the first time, January, and 46 again. The first 45, they achieved the right to vote, and 46, the right to be voted on. So it was a long process, but the beginning is interesting, and this reminds me of this Detour book. Why is it interesting? Because the decision to give them the right to vote, that was not yet it was, 45 was still a provisional government, not yet the new Italy with the new constitution, with democracy, it was still in the war. And the decision to give women the right to vote was taken by the government, provisional government, on January the 31st, I'm sorry, 45, in a moment like that, without even discussion. To imagine 100 years of fighting for voting, fighting for emancipation, and then everything happened like without any effort. Because this happened in a very strange way, oniric, quasi, because there was a phone call between Togliatti and De Gasperi to make it quick and speed the situation without discussion. That was the last item of 6 items of the day of a decree. It was a logo tenenziale, decreto logo tenenziale, a decree by the government to recognize the right to vote to women. Then, of course, the year after, another piece of legislation, and then 10 years after, also prostitutes, after the dismantling of the bordels, so-called. The women also, former prostitutes, they could vote. So they were not allowed to vote until 55. So this book is interesting because while the women at the beginning, they contributed in the making of the constitution and the making of democracy. Italy became democracy for everybody in 1 year, in with the vote. It was not a long process of democratization. We had fascism, we had the war, and then democracy started immediately with women inside. It was the first time that women voted for the Constitutional Assembly. They voted for the referendum. So democracy began democratic. There was not a long process, right? Like in other democracies. This is interesting, right? And this quickness, this velocity at the beginning was stopped immediately after. It was as if there was a kind of obsession with the too much liberty that women were living and enjoying. And this liberty needs to be understood. So there is a book by Miriam Maffei, a very important scholar, about women who fought for the resistance and before and after. And she collected many interviews from women who participated in one way or another in the resistance, and they were all upset. Why? Two reasons. First, they fought so much in order to be free from family. So they didn't go to fight for big ideas, like, new family, new life, or new society. No, they really fought and they left home young people. They were very young, these women, between 16 and 18 and 19, in order to be free, to choose the way in which they wanted to live. So basically liberal freedom, right? As they say, we wanted to fight like men, to dress like men, to live in the hide with men without any constrainment by mother, fathers, sisters, and brothers, and so on and so forth. So an act of freedom, the desire of freedom. And this desire of freedom immediately had to find some obstacles, of course, in the hide and in the brigades, in the partisan brigades. Why? Because women discover that they were asked to do exactly what they were doing at home. So cooking, cleaning or washing the dishes, I don't know. This is, they were replicating in the hide, in the fight, the same condition of women they were living before. So this is the first kind of upset situation they lived. The second upset situation they lived was just after, when there was the celebration moment of April the 25th, 1945, with the long, parades in the cities with military soldiers from the Allies, but also partisan soldiers. Now, there was a discussion before where women should march with men in the parades, because some of them, they were really general, so-called, in the partisan groups, like men, and yet they were, in many cases, Milan, look at the photo, the picture you see, Milan is very important, Genoa, very, very important, women were not allowed to march in the first row of the partisan battalions. Second, third rows. Why? This is very interesting, because the partisan men, fighters, they were not ordinary regular army, of course. They had to conquer honor. Honor was not connected to their position, right? They were not soldiers. So they had to conquer their honor, and it was not honorable to show a kind of promiscuity with women in the fight. Promiscuity, yeah? And for this reason, they decided not to have women there. So as soon as the ordinary life started, this process of detour to the old condition of subjections inside of the family, inside of the working place, it was evident. So, for instance, women could not be magistrates until, for a long time, until the 55, even more, even later, and so on and so forth. So it was a gradual process of actualization of the Constitution. In this sense, they were much less free in the 50s than they were in 45. And they had to reconquer this freedom. And this reconquest was, I like this book for this reason very much, it was a kind of detour. So they used another way to reach that emancipation, which was not the strong way of politics, which was not the way of masculine fight for your freedom, but it was another way, which is through the market, through commodification, through music and movies, that is through the ordinary life of private life, private, not political and public, in order to achieve that kind of popular presence, dignified and equal, which was never there, by the way. That was a kind of, this is a kind of a way to emancipation by other means. That is not the means of politics, but the means of music. And by the way, these contradictory elements that I try to share with you is also confirmed by some songs that are very ugly, some of them, truly, particularly the 50s. They are terrible, very obscene, I would say. But they are an indication of the contradiction after all. There is one in particular, if you know Italian, I suggest you to listen to, because it's a very obscene in the sexual sense, in a condition of conformism and very, very traditionalism. So the song by Nilla Pizzi, My Don, the name of the song is Edera, the ivy, the ivy. So there is a word in this song that is fabulous, that is, I am entwined to you. This kind of absurdity that in the 58, you wouldn't even think of a woman, you know, this kind of. And on the other hand, you had all this stability of family organizations in which women were simply the mother and the whatever. So these contradictions are nice because it is like an interstice in which you can infiltrate some freedom and the ability of breaking the censorship by the church in particular and by the democratic Christian, which was suffocating. So it was a way of introducing elements of emancipation and freedom in these different strange ways. So for this reason, I really think that this book is a quasi-document to use it to integrate, to complete the process of emancipation, which was achieved by women themselves on the ground, and then they had to find another way to, you know, to go on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for including me in this event. It was a pleasure to read your book, Elizabeth. And it was a pleasure to read this book because it is a book that validates an approach that I personally, as a scholar, I've been proposing for 3 decades, which is Italian cultural studies. This is what Italian cultural studies is about. It is about, you know, its cultural history. It is something that is far too often not done. And you do so by bringing together high and low, as you said, by bringing together cinema, television, books, novels, and music. And by reading the lyrics of songs as a literary scholar would read poetry. And that takes a lot of guts. You know, it takes a lot of guts to look at Nilla Pizzi and, you know, and actually break down Grazia dei Fiori for what it really was, which you do, right? And you do the same with Rita Pavone. You certainly do the same with Nonna Letà. And Gigliola Cinquetti, to whom you dedicate a lot of space. But then again, she deserved it because she was a watershed. I mean, 1964, the winning of, you know, of the Sanremo Festival, and then the Euro Festival. It really marks a watershed. I enjoyed hearing what you said about what people, you know, what early the first person you showed the book to, the first publisher. The reaction was, why is this not there? So, I mean, like Nadia, I read my life as I read your book, and this is why it was a page turner. I wasn't born when Nilla Pizzi was singing, but shortly thereafter. And certainly Nilla Pizzi was all about, was everywhere in the tales of my family. And she was certainly on television in the 80s and 90s, thanks to Paolo Limiti for many, many years. Many of the singers that you discussed are they're household names to generations and generations of Italians. You have included their work in a larger narrative, which is a larger cultural narrative. You have recovered their voices and woven them in, together with, works that we wouldn't think of next to one another, like Alba de Cespedes and Dacia Maraini, both authors that are very dear to me in terms of scholarship, but also to the cinema of that time. And it's not auteur cinema that you're looking at, thank God, because that is not your project, right? But it is tempting to say, so what is on the cutting floor, right? I mean, we're scholars of cinema. The cutting floor exists. So why Cinquetti and not Fratello? I mean, why aren't you talking about Sono una donna, non sono una santa, which was an anthem, and it certainly spoke to, how women perceive themselves at that point. It makes sense, but your narrative makes sense. I mean, and so does the playlist that you create, because I really do want to think about this book as a long playlist that starts in the 50s and that ends at a very specific point in time. Your book ends with the end of paleo television. It ends with Sticks, which was like a huge deal on television, even though it disappeared right away because it was censored. It was like, the show that featured Patti Bravo without a top, dressing with her breast in full view on public television. That was clearly things that changed. Clearly we were way, past Julia De Palma, to whom you dedicate the space that she deserves. I think that the strength of bringing these things together, the strength of talking about the role that Sanremo played for Italian society at large, is extremely important. By the same token, I would say that if on one hand Sanremo was important, Canzonissima was just as important.
Yes.
Because Sanremo was only 3 nights a week. In the 70s, it was 3 nights a week. Now it's like every day of the week for a whole week, right? But Canzonissima lasted 4 months, and it was
3 days a year.
Sanremo is 3 days a year.
Not a week.
No, not a week. 3 days a year. But 3 days of the week, whereas now it's a whole week. Sanremo. Canzonissima lasted 4 months, and Canzonissima had people vote from home. And you had this process of gradual elimination, and you really got to know the singers, right? But it is true that it is Sanremo that defined who went to the Eurofestival, for instance. And it certainly is the event that gathered the whole population and that created these enmities. I was particularly struck with what you do with Luigi Tenco and Orietta Berti. I do not necessarily agree that Io tu e le rose and Ciao Bambina Ciao can be read next to one another. I mean, I still think that, that there are very strong differences between the two. But I do see your point. I completely see your point. And I think that it speaks to the time that these works were produced in. I think that, 40 years later, 50 years later, to see Orietta Berti now, and Orietta Berti, Gigliola Cinquetti, Rita Pavone, they're there still. They're still, presences they're cultural presences. What is interesting Patti Bravo, just as much. What is interesting is that one of them has disappeared, even though she's quite present in your book, Caterina Caselli. Yeah, she's the most powerful one because she's the one who went behind the scene and became a music producer and took really ownership of the industry. And this is really a point for me, and I really would like to hear your thoughts on this, because at one point you say that with Nell'Italia, gender becomes the master signifier. I really enjoyed what you said there. And it is true that in the 60s, something changes completely and gender becomes something to look at. But going back to Caterina Caselli taking over sugar, taking over the industry, becoming a powerful player to the point that in the 90s and in the 2000s, she's, behind the decisions of victories at Sanremo. She's really powerful. When you talk about cultural production by women in this book, and you mention all these singers, what do you make of the fact that these songs were largely written by men? I mean, is this what ventriloquizing is taking place when, when Non ho l'età and, and La Bambola and Nessuno mi può giudicare and, and any song by Rita Pavone were indeed written by men, because the parolieri were men in Italy up to, for a long time, they still are. And I think that complicates the argument. I'm still completely sold on the argument, but I wonder how, where you stand when it comes to that. I really enjoyed what you did with Diabolic.
Yeah, me too.
I think that, Diabolic, and I loved how you pinpointed the role of gatekeeper of popular culture that Umberto Eco played. Because it's not that necessarily we had, just because Umberto Eco made popular culture visible, named it, gave it power, gave it value, that doesn't mean that we have to agree with all these statements. And the reductive position, the way that he reduced some of these figures and some of these products is necessarily not true, like, looking at this years and years ago. And I think of, like in the 90s, for instance, I was discussing this with Matteo earlier today. In the 90s, Fabio Fazio and Claudio Baglioni reevaluate the 70s and the 80s through a program that became a cult called Anima Mia, that reevaluated a whole period, and it reevaluated through songs, through television shows, through films, through objects. And it sort of reevaluated the agency of some of these products and the role that they played in the development of the cultural imaginary. And I think that what we're really, the stake here is how these songs contributed to the cultural imaginary, right? I mean, it's because regardless of who wrote the song, Gigliola Cinquetti is Non ho l'età. But she's also La Domenica Andando alla Messa, right? I mean, it's just as, just as Caterina Caselli is Nessuno mi può giudicare and Insieme a te non ci sto più. And a lot of sign Perdono right in the middle. I mean, Musicarelli, I love the fact that you actually spend a lot of time talking about the Musicarelli, because the Musicarelli, which were a genre of cinema that brought popular music, to the large audience by showing the singers play actors for a while, usually playing themselves, but within films. Well, the kind of pervasive effect that Musicarelli had in the years that they were filmed is incomparable, and they've been completely forgotten, and they have not been studied, and they have not been, you see them on repeat on television, but they have not been released on DVDs, they are not available on streaming, yet they were extremely important. And it's really, I think that, like the role that music played in the cultural imaginary of the time speaks to one of the things that probably Nadia remembers as well, that was really a key to our generations, which was the cantagiro, the fact that music, moved, that it was not just Sanremo, it was not just Canzonissima. Cantagiro moved around Italy, you know, it was this carrozzone that went around Italy and showed music to everyone and played music for everyone. This was the time that everyone had, you know, the mangiadischi with them. Just as, you know, in the 80s, Toto would talk about l'autoradio nella mano destra in l'italiano. But I mean, this changes, this is the earlier version of it. But certainly it has a lot to contribute. But again, thank you for showing us and showing our Italian, you know, partners in Italy, because this book is for an Italian reader, what cultural studies is about. Thank you.
Okay, wow, thank you all. These were really, really fantastic interventions and very rich with suggestions about how to think about the project. In no particular order. Where do I, which is the problem. Where do I want to start here? Actually, in order. So Rebecca's observations about the scooter, I think, are really important, and about maintaining forms of conventional forms of femininity, right? Acceptable forms of femininity. And what I spend a lot of time in the book is doing is thinking about how those forms are emerging, evolving, devolving, and how contradictory or conflicting paradigms can coexist at the same time. So, you know, so for those of you who didn't recognize the Gigliola Cinquetti reference to non ho l'età, right? I'm not old enough is the song that she sings in 1964, and she's a very young teenager, and she's on the stage and she's weeping with fear. Yeah, but she sings the song, and then it becomes extremely powerful. The song is about not being old enough to love somebody, right? Being a girl, being too young, trembling on the brink of womanhood, of a womanhood that involves commitment and sexuality, but not being there yet, right? At the same time, more or less, we've got Rita Pavone, who is thrilled that she's a teenager, thrilled that she doesn't need to engage in the behaviors, the activities, the forms of dress, the performance of a kind of femininity that she doesn't feel like she needs, she doesn't want. At the same time, we've got Caterina Caselli singing about how great it is just to be in her movie, for example, one of the movies, to be doing her thing, right? To be working and to be singing in the band. And at the same time, yet again, we've got La Parmigiana, Bruno Piatti, right? Sleeping with basically everything that moves because she's bored. Why not? Yeah. Or Maraini, L'età del malessere, also a young teenager, just having sex because, yeah. So, you know, and eating La Torta Pasquale, right? That's basically the whole book. So I'm really interested in these conflicting forms of femininity that are being performed, and then that evolve even later into yet another series of paradigms, right? Patti Bravo in her smoking, yeah, looking more like David Bowie than anything else. Huh? These are all different forms of femininity getting worked out. And the performance of them is being foregrounded. So you mentioned Eva Kant, for example, from Diabolique. The form of the fumetto is important because this is a way, the irrealism, the anti-realism of the fumetto is a way of foregrounding the fact that gender is being constructed before our very eyes, right? So in that sense, the early 60s is a really rich moment. We're seeing a consciousness emerging of not just about other various forms or spectrum of forms about femininity, but also their constructedness, right? The fact that this is all just made up in a certain sense. The question of prostitutes voting in 1955, I think, is a fascinating one. It's terrific, and reminds me of one of the conflicts that emerges in these years, and that has to do with conflicts among women. One of the things that I started out by saying was that these acquisitions weren't necessarily feminist. They were often simply feminine, yeah? And that helps us understand, I think, another set of conflicts that has to do with feminism on the one hand and the left on the other, and feminism on the one hand and a sort of right-thinking intellectualism. So, for example, Comizi d'amore, yeah, Pasolini, 1964. There's a long section dedicated to prostitutes, but who comments on the prostitutes? Oriana Fallaci, right? Camilla Cederna, and they see these hideously top-down, snobbish things about prostitutes, suggesting that there's zero kind of not even solidarity, but understanding of the forces that push women into these positions, right? So one of the things that I try to think about is the ways. Sorry, I should foreground all this by saying my doctor prohibited me from drinking coffee about 3 weeks ago. So I'm putting sentences together, but I think you're following me. One of the things that these conflicts suggest is that there's a lot of tension among both among women and among the left and feminists. I'm sorry, I've just repeated myself, but I think you know where I'm going. And the partisan example, I think, is a terrific one because it supports my argument about how social freedoms and political actions are both two-way streets and often mutually exclusive at the same time, right? So Renata Vigano can write L'Agnese va a morire, right? Having been one of the front, one of the strongest of her group, one of the leaders of her partisan group, someone who carried a weapon as well as, was able convincingly to produce ideological justifications for the war, who then goes on to write about a sort of lumpy middle-aged woman who does nothing but cook for the partisans and apologizes for not being good enough to do things properly, right? So the same figures are contradictory in those ways. Cinquetti and not fratello, because one of the points of the book, I think, is that the politics that are happening at this very banal way. By the time Fratello can say what she says, all of this stuff has already been absorbed. So my first 3 books were about cultural elites, that is, people willing to die for an idea. My 4th book was about the kind of refusal to politicize what are in fact very deeply political actions. And this is a book about how politics happens in this enormously banal way. It's performed by regular people in their absolute non-exceptionality. Fratello is exceptional in that sense, right? The woman in her kitchen humming along to Non ho nessuno mi può giudicare is important precisely because of her non-exceptionality. And pop culture is a big part of that politicization. No major social movement happens without points of reference to pop culture. So the idea is about giving voice, returning a voice to the value that we all, in our normalness, in our non-exceptionality, in our non-hardcore feminist moments, give to these objects. And the same is with Caterina Caselli, I think is the same. She's not a surprise in a sense, right? She was there all along. Women who surprise us for the ways they have longevity, I think, are the ones that we don't expect to be performing these actions. And so it's not by surprise that Giulio Cinquetti, for example, returns to Sanremo recently, right, and recuperates that move in a way that suggests that she actually could have been read already back in the day as having anticipated resistance and having recouched it in the terms that would be acceptable to a masculinist universe. And then I guess the last thing I'm going to say is about the left. These artifacts were capillary in a way that the official culture of the left and the official kind of politicized artifacts being promoted by the left were not. In 1964, Villeneuve conducted a survey about who the workers' favorite musicians were, right? It was Mina. They wanted Mina. They didn't want Caterina Bueno. Yeah. And so La Domenica Andando alla Messa, okay, cheesy as you like, right? But it's only cheesy in a universe in which Caterina Bueno is saying that's not authentic. That's not folk, right? Instead, what that song did, this is Giuliola Cinquetti dressed in a kind of dirndl and singing like she's going to church, and oi lili, oi la la, everyone wants me because I'm so pretty, right? That is a song that moves the needle towards a kind of appreciation of authentic, if that's what we want to call it. At the same time, Giovanna Marini's doing what? Making shit up, right? For all that she's promoting a certain, kind of authenticity of pop music, right? The autochthonous and so on and so forth. She's inventing it, right? These are new constructions, as it were. So I think when we take away this notion that the authentic, the autochthonous is somehow, by definition, superior, then we move into a space where La Domenica Andando alla Messa can have value, if that makes sense. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there and we can open it up.
We now have time for questions from the audience.
Well, actually, just to break the ice, I have two questions. One is writing the book in Italian, no? The necessity to bring cultural studies and to a Italian reading public. So I would like to know more about not only your approach to Italian, but the project of the book. Why in Italian there is a need for this kind of study, or what is your position in choosing a language? And you talk about at the beginning the struggle with the editors and so on. So how did you thought about a book with your expertise, but also with a different code and rhetoric? And the other question is about the high and the low, and RCA hiring Ennio Morricone and all the arrangementi of Ennio Morricone of many of these popular songs. So, and how is this effect of this person that was actually taken from very high and experimental music and then doing the, I don't know, the arrangement in English, but for Gianni Morandi and so on. So how do you see also that in that moment, especially in the 70s?
Great, good. Thank you. Well, so like I said, this is the book previous to this, the one about Tex Willer, has a kind of a similar project in the sense that I take what has been considered a fairly banal and totally, highly disseminated popular culture object and say, you know what, but actually there's stuff happening here. Yeah, and insofar as text has never been translated into English and the English speaking world doesn't really care about text, it was natural that I would work on that book in Italian. Here, I wanted to do something similar. I wanted to engage not just with the material itself, but also with the cultural analysis that would surrounded, right, these objects. I wanted to engage specifically with the idea that all of these histories are half histories. And to do that, I had to address the people who were actually talking, who were creating those histories. I wanted to address the idea that that it was that a high-powered editor could legitimately say, but you're missing these 5 people, not because they had something to say about my argument, right? because there were just more examples of the same, but because because what he expected was a longer version of the same 20 pages of the chapter on women at the end of the history of Italian music. And the question of Morricone is really interesting. I mean, so their disco, right, or Dick Hebdige, if you want, have both taught us that there's all of this slippage between protest and pleasure, between counterculture and mainstream culture. And so the idea that one can be elevated or devalued or disseminated kind of willy-nilly, I think is an interesting one and a familiar one. My feeling is that the more the merrier. If we can turn this into abstract art, fantastic. If we can dumb it down, as it were, that's in quotes, so that, let's take disco as an example, so that every wedding you've ever been to in the last 40 years has disco music, because it's what gets people onto the dance floor, even though it started as a safe space, an alternative space for a kind of cultural exile, is fine. That's okay. I don't think that necessarily dehistoricizes the project. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Looking forward, read it. Very fun.
I have a question. I'm wondering about your own positionality. You were talking about your earlier books and kind of the ways in which they're navigating both high and then this move to the banal, the shift to the banal. And also, I mean, as I read it, I felt this immense sense of relief for all the projects that I had thought about before, that I thought not only like was the level of cultural status high enough, but also my own positionality, particularly as a female researcher. And so that there was not only the like discrediting of the object, but also my interest in the object. And I wonder if that played any role, or whether that wasn't part of the conception of that.
That's interesting. So with texts, there was some pushback, but not because I'm a woman necessarily, but because I'm American. How dare I claim to have any kind of, insight into this world? But at the same time, there were people who said, "Oh wow, I've been reading text my entire life. Everybody in my family's been reading text for their entire life, and it never occurred to me to think about it in these terms." So kind of on the strength of that, I thought, well, what the hell? And it worked out okay. Continuing to think about your question in connection to Mattia's question, I think Giancarlo's observations about cultural studies are really important here too, right? This is not something Italians tend to do.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
They actually frown upon it.
Yeah.
It's different.
Yes. It's yeah. And I've been told that my work is too interdisciplinary to be legitimate in the Italian Academy. So I mean, there's a huge perspective question happening here, but you just do you.
It's interesting what you said, because in the country of Gramsci, so suppose to have Gramsci here, if he wants to understand how popular culture express politics, he would do exactly this book. He would like to read this book, not right? So it's always very strange to me every time I think about the idea they have of culture in Italy is so stratospheric, very high. This is not forever. It's so, and on the same times they comment on Gramsci, they write about Gramsci, but they don't write. It's very strange, this incapability of grasping what he was saying. Right? So I recognize much more this kind of literature than others.
I mean, Italy is the country where, using the term nazional popolare was used as a way to kick out people from right. I mean, it's just, it's negative. It's exactly it.
Oh, Anna.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have two questions, two curiosities. One, I was just wondering, since you spoke also of the project on text, if you notice any difference in terms of how the books were received also, because I don't think all kinds of popular cultures are framed the same way, and text is a very masculine product. And I'm thinking of how even high, what are considered high authors, somehow introduce pop culture like science fiction or westerns, or like I'm thinking of Michele Mari, for instance, and how they are coded as something you can talk about, whereas to me, like, you know, female singers or pop culture is really connoted. And I was just wondering if there was a difference in the way the two books were received and perceived, both outside academia and inside, particularly in Italy. And the other thing is a bit my comparatist moment. I was just thinking if you could spend a couple of more words on if you thought of this project comparatively, both in terms of, you briefly mentioned, it was briefly mentioned that the situation in Italy was different. So if you were thinking about singers in other countries, in other languages, and also since cultural studies have been developed much more in other languages, what was the role for you of having this scholarship, but a new context in Italy? If you could spend some words on that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna. The receptions were quite different in a sense. I mean, people were very open to texts, but there was a lot of concern that I was calling him a fascist. There was some hesitation about where exactly I was positioning him on the political spectrum and what it meant to be a reader of text. And so there was some resistance there. Although I think we sort of worked through it. With Fuori, coro, I thought comparatively much more in terms of film. There were lots of dialogues taking place, it seemed to me, between Italian film production and American film production with respect to certain themes, especially in the 1960s, but also earlier. And that's where the predominantly comparative work takes place in this book. The other thing about reception is, like I said, my experience with female audiences, predominantly female audiences, is that they're really, much like was said today on the panel, it's a kind of embodied response, much less than an intellectual response, right? They're really talking about having lived those experiences, about they've got anecdotes about their own lives. And that's different from the text situation. No one has an anecdote about riding through the desert and, you know, eating a plate of beefsteaks this high, that kind of thing. Thank you.
Just kind of picking up on Anna's question as well. I was wondering, it strikes me that in sort of the pop cultural space, there's also like a series of additional forces, I guess, like market forces and things like that, like the success of these songs. And I'm thinking too, in you know, post World War II Italy, there's also sort of an influx, right, of like American capital and things like this, and like the world is also changing, becoming like more global. And I'm just wondering like how these factors also kind of contribute to this story, and how you've like considered them and included them in your analysis as well.
Yeah, yes. Which brings us back to Giancarlo's observation that it's the men doing the writing, but it's the women doing the performance. It's the women who embody, right? It's the women's voices that we hear. And I think there's something important about the embodiment and the acoustic, you know, introjection of this music, besides the visual, that tips the scale towards reading these as women's products, even when it has to be acknowledged that many of the songs are written by men. So the book starts with the Vespa, but then I think about Sanremo and later about the Urlatori as bearers of a kind of conciliatory culture. And this is with respect both to gender and to national identity, right? One of the things that the women in Sanremo do early on is they perform a kind of sentimental nostalgia, right? That acknowledges but doesn't acknowledge fascism in some way, right? And that's really important at the level of kind of reconstruction of a national, you know, identity, both for Italians and outside of Italy. The Urlatori do something similar, right? There's this push and pull that they perform. Sure, they ride Vespas and they wear blue jeans, but in a lot of these musicarelli, what they do is they run around helping old people. Right? They realize that if they're going to be accepted, then they have to change their image. And so they fight to get the veterans' pension back. Yeah, they're performing a kind of new generation of Italian subject that in a certain sense is not all that different from the kids holding hands and marching down the hill, right? Like we're studying in my neorealism class towards St. Peter's at the end of Rome Open City, right? They're all, this is the new generation of Italians. It's not just for for a national audience. There's also a very kind of bifocal international gaze happening here. And I think it's the women who are doing the heavy lifting culturally, both of kind of negotiating reconciliation with the fascist past and a democratic present, and negotiating generational differences, right? It's not just gender that's being fixed here. It's also all kinds of other things for an international public as well. Does that make sense? Okay. Did I get the date for nell'Italia completely wrong? I'm feeling now like I said something insane. Okay, that's what I said. Okay, good. I thought, yeah, okay, good. Somehow I thought when I said it, I said something insane.
And she's now going to be a judge, you know, in talent shows. I mean, she's career as she's still there.
Right.
She's still there.
This is
She's actually not a judge.
She was right. She was very, I didn't know about.
Yeah, but this is important. Women are doing the shape shifting that allows them to continue to be the standard bearers of certain forms of Italian identity.
Hi, Professor Leake. Thank you for your talk. I have a question that is, I guess, about, so it is this dynamic that you have sort of argued between a sort of male coded counterculture, like a high culture of counterculture versus the sort of female coded pop culture. Is this historically specific, do you think, and how does it, is it something that can only be diagnosed in the period that you discussed, and what happens after when these sort of boundaries between pop and counterculture break down in the years after?
Yeah, I see your question. So I mean, it's really all Tenko's fault. I'm sorry. I think an argument can be made that that because of the hegemony of the left in the post-war, and then the pendulum swaying back towards the center, right, soon thereafter, what's getting played out is particularly virulent in these years, particularly present in these years, right? Togliatti is telling everybody on the left not to, you know, that the housewife should spank her own children harder than her neighbor's children, and so communists should have to write more communist than anybody else, right? These are the years in which people like Vittorini are tinkering around, going, oh, it's industrial literature. I don't know what industrial literature is. Let's think about this. How can we do this? We have to ride the tiger of the, you know, of the popular. So the vertici of the party are saying we need to ride the tiger, that is to say, control from the forces from below of pop culture, so that we can push it in the direction of popular or more authentic culture. But the fact is, you know, you ride the tiger that you've got, and if the tiger says, I want Mina, then you give him Mina. Yeah. But I think with the waning of the left, these tensions have become, with the waning of certain forms of the left, I should say, right, especially the Communist Party, some of these tensions have become have taken a backseat to other tensions, it seems to me. But these were very important years in terms of what was acceptable to certain forms of political culture, what was recognized as a certain form of political culture. So yeah, I mean, I would say the short answer is yes. This was a particularly important historical moment.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to the Heyman Center, and thank you to all the panelists and Elizabeth.